All right, so Will is a fifth generation native of Baldwin County, Alabama, and still lives on his family farm where he grew up learning to love nature. He holds a Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science degrees in wildlife biology from Auburn University. And Will works as a stewardship coordinator at the Grand Bay Near in coastal Mississippi. I was heavily involved in designing and implementing a research and monitoring platform for understanding the impacts of sea level rise on coastal systems, while also working with federal, state, and local partners to accomplish local and regional conservation and restoration activities. He has worked for the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources for the past 4 years in the implementation of the Alabama Coastal Area Management Program. Will was recently appointed as the Coastal Section Administrator for the ADCNR State Lands Division and provides oversight to both coastal zone management and the Weeks Bay Near. And he enjoys spending time with his two daughters, botanizing the wilds of the Southeast and building useful things in his vintage woodworking shop. Cool. All right, Will, I'm going to let you go ahead and share your screen and start up your presentation.
Thank you, Carrie. Very excited to get to share with you all today a little bit about how I got into the world of conservation and what the path I've been through and where I'm heading with my life. Can you see my screen now? Okay, great. So I titled this Deeply Rooted in the Coastal Plain, My Conservation Journey, just because I really have been kind of settled in one place for a long time and I have a lot of deep family roots. That picture that I'm showing there, that's my grandfather in the back of that wagon and my great-great-grandfather who's actually feeding those hogs. So we've been in this place for a long time and we that lets you build some connections and some understanding of a place. It helps you to really think about how you can manage it. I've always been involved in the outdoors, as from a young age, being outside more than inside, and that really has driven me to really want to be a conservationist. Always been an avid outdoorsman, canoeing, kayaking, hiking, hunting and fishing. I was very active in 4-H as a kid, and also in our environmental sciences club in high school. And I've chosen to stay here and raise my family here on the coast. I have a lot of things that keep me excited. I like to say that I chase shiny objects. I get excited about something, I move in that direction, and woodworking is one of those things that really floats my boat, so to say. And I like to be out in nature taking pictures. I like to get out on the water. Like to be around friends, picking a little bluegrass at times, and just like to explore a lot of different things. And most of those things have some connection to being outside. When I think about what kind of fixed my course in my high school years of getting in the direction of going into wildlife biology, I knew I wanted to do some sort of an outside field. There were a couple of things that were very formative for me. One was my involvement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Youth Conservation Corps. So I spent a couple of years working at the Bonchkir National Wildlife Refuge in that Youth Conservation Corps program. And in that, we did things like building wood duck boxes and installing those up in the Mobile Delta. We created trails. If you've ever been to the Bonchkir Refuge and walked on the Jeff Friend Trail, we cut that trail one summer. Just a variety of things there that allowed me to get out and further solidify my desire to be out in nature. I also spent about a 10-day stint at the Safari Club International American Wilderness Leadership School. And that was an opportunity to go out outside of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and basically immerse myself in the natural world and think about how do you lead people in that environment. And so that was a very important part of my development there as well. And when in your life, we always have mentors that we look up to. There were a couple that were very important to me. My dad is in the picture on the upper left. He was a college-educated farmer who just had a desire to come home and be back on the land. And he had this perpetual curiosity about being outside. Even in his last days, he was was wanting to learn, wanting to understand more. He had a passion for teaching people about native trees and trying to push folks to landscape with native plants. And so that was, I think I picked up some of that curiosity from him. He would wonder at the smallest little thing that he would find. He was never missing a chance to learn and always trying to help teach what he saw. The other very important figure in my life, the lower right-hand corner, that's George Folkerts. He was a professor at Auburn University. He was a wetland biologist, but he also was very interested in how humans interact with the environment. He was one of those folks that preferred that you did not call him Dr. Folkerts. He wanted to be called George. He wanted to be just, he didn't put himself on a pedestal because he had a PhD. And, spending time in the woods with two of these fellows here made me really understand what it meant to be a naturalist, to want to share that with other people. So my educational background, I went to Auburn University and studied wildlife biology. That time period that I was there, I started in '93 as an undergrad. And that time period was kind of a transitional period for wildlife biology. There was kind of a traditional hook and bullet side of wildlife, folks that were going to work for the State Conservation Agency as a wildlife manager on a management area. But it was beginning to merge into more of a field of ecology and conservation and kind of outside of that traditional use category. And we were having a lot more non-traditional students come in, folks who really didn't have that background growing up on a farm. So it was a really interesting time to be in that university background. We got to think about a lot of different diverse philosophies of land management, conservation. I worked for a few years as a technician at our captive deer research facility. Did some independent research on plumage coloration and house finches. Red males are they really do well with ladies. After that, I went into carried on at Auburn to get a master's degree in wildlife science as well. Did some work there with black bears, where I was looking to assess how the public viewed bears. What kind of concerns did they have? Did they know much about them? Did they care? Did they want more bears in Alabama or fewer bears? And at that time, we had a very small population just north of Mobile. Now there are bears in some other parts of the state because they've basically moved back in, but we had nearly extirpated bears from the state. And so through that effort, I conducted town hall meetings across the state. So I got to travel around and see different people. That was a very interesting kind of diversion from the straight up wildlife biology, where I was doing more social science, beginning to understand the human interaction with nature, what people thought, sometimes somebody's perceptions, whether or not they're based on fact, can be a very strong driver in how they interact with the environment. I learned about multiple fictitious creatures from those meetings that folks think they have seen. It was pretty interesting to see what people, our eyes and our minds can trick us in many ways. So it was kind of cool to get to see that. I carried on from there and entered into a dissertation program working with white-tailed deer. And so I designed a study looking at, I was working in a high fence enclosure, which if you're not familiar with that, that's basically a deer-proof fence. This place was a square mile, and we were trapping deer within that and looking at offspring sex ratio. So looking to see if that high density of deer caused there to be a difference from 1 to 1. You'd expect half males, half females in your offspring sex ratio. And found some interesting things there. There was a very high density, so that causes social stress. It can cause some resource limitation, and males are dispersing sex, so you would expect more males in that situation, and that's what we were seeing. So males would be the ones who would be able to leave the home range, but when you have a high fence there, they can't leave. And so all of a sudden you're getting densities of 300 or 400 deer in a square mile, whereas in a natural unfenced condition, you might have 30 in a square mile, 60. That's a big number. So that was pretty cool. That was 4 or 5 years of my life, and I never finished up the dissertation, but I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed that time there. I had a lot of good friends who I helped them with their research, so don't regret a single minute of it. But it was one thing I learned very early in that project was it really wasn't my passion to be doing that, and I was in it and had to continue with it, but it wasn't something that really, it wasn't out looking at plants, and it wasn't out, exploring. It was the side of that wildlife world that I wasn't as crazy about. So interspersed in all of that, I did quite a bit of other work as a technician and working with other folks in coastal habitats. I spent a lot of time in the Mobile-Tensas Delta. We were surveying vegetation, herps, wading birds. That was interesting. We had randomly spaced points throughout the Delta. Some of those you could walk on quite easily. Some of them you were up to your chest in muck, trying to take vegetation samples. Lots of gators and snakes, and probably the worst thing was wasps. Walking through all the palmetto bushes, the little paper wasps that my elbows stayed stung pretty much every day. And then I spent a couple years down at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida trapping black bears. That was phenomenal time. The Eglin Air Force Base reservation is about 750 square miles of land, basically from about Milton, Florida, over to the other side of Crestview. And that is a phenomenal slice of nature that's been preserved for military operations. So day one of our training there was explosive ordnance disposal. How do you avoid all of the miscellaneous shells that are on the ground out there? What to pick up, what not to pick up. Basically, don't pick up anything. But that was an interesting slice of life. And we trapped a bunch of bears with radio collars on them. We went around and tried to find where they were hanging out, what they were eating. So that was quite an experience. I then spent some time up in the Red Hills of Alabama. So if you're driving from Mobile to Montgomery, up around Greenville and Evergreen, you pass through some kind of hilly areas there. We have an endemic salamander that lives there, basically in 5 counties in the state of Alabama. It was only discovered in the 1960s. Kind of amazing to think we're still finding those kind of animals. There was some entomologist who was out flipping logs and just happened to find one. They spend most of their time in a burrow in these north-facing cliff slopes. And so it was very rugged terrain we were working in. We spent a lot of time, I had keys to pretty much all of International Paper Company's land across that 5-county range. And we actually had to rappel down these cliff faces to hold ourselves up on the face to actually survey the burrows. So we were finding all the burrows. The burrows are about as wide as a quarter. So very tiny little burrows in the face of these cliffs that those salamanders are living in, and they sit at the mouth of that burrow and they catch things like crickets at night. But that was, and if you've ever been to the Appalachian Mountains, Cove Hardwoods, really beautiful places that you don't think about being in South Alabama, but we do have some of those areas. So that was a really cool place to be, and some interesting field work. One thing I have a real passion for is prescribed fire. And that's something I know you guys have had a little bit of training in, have helped with some fire lane creation and things, and probably not as much actual burning as you'd like to have. Prescribed fire is one of those things that takes a lot of on the ground experience to get to where you're comfortable enough to actually conduct a fire yourself. And but it's a vital thing for our habitats here in the Southeast. A fire every 1 to 3 years in most habitats is what we need to have. Just a couple of days ago, Eric from Weeks Bay and I were out looking at some of those sites that y'all have been working on, trying to decide when we're going to put a fire in there this year. Maybe we'll be back to working by the time that happens, so y'all can maybe help out. But it's one of those things that it's a mix of having to have the experience and knowledge, but also having to make sure that you are following all the procedures and making sure that you're protecting the public. Smoke on the road is a bad thing, and so we have to be really careful that we don't have that we don't lose containment of a fire and have smoke problems. Have a pretty big interest in wetland ecology, just from being outside and enjoying these environments. So much so that George Folkers that I mentioned earlier, I was kind of his unofficial teaching assistant for about 7 years at Auburn, where every trip he took to South Florida, I drove a van for him and served as helping out on those wetland biology field trips. That is something that is beginning to be missing from a lot of undergraduate curriculums and graduate curriculums, are those field experiences where you actually, hop in a van with an instructor and go for 3 or 4 or 5 days and experience something. It's costly. The insurance and the liability of getting in a van like that with folks, because it's something a lot of universities are cutting that from their programs in a large way. And that field experience is something that it's irreplaceable. We also did a trip with him that was a whole month in the Southern Appalachians. So we had 2 vans full of people, and we went for a month up through the Southern Appalachians. We got a hotel about every 4th night, so we just slept out on the ground, and fantastic memories of that. I'm a firm believer that we should always try to educate folks with what we learn. We should do that out in the field. Any chance that we possibly get, we should do that in the classroom. We should do something to try to, any piece of knowledge that we can impart, especially on kids. Young kids are really so impressionable. And I'm a firm believer in trying to teach them about things that are local to them. I was kind of shocked 10 years ago. I went to a elementary class. I think it was a 2nd grade class. The teacher had asked me to come in and talk about some of my work. And those 2nd graders were learning about the rainforest. I was like, well, that's great. The rainforest is an interesting place, but what about their backyard? What about the longleaf pine forest? What about the environments that they live in and interact with every day? And I think we miss a lot of opportunities to teach people about things that really matter to them in their local area. So as Carrie mentioned, I spent about 7 years working for the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources as the stewardship coordinator. So you all know Eric Brunden at Weeks Bay. He's the stewardship coordinator there. I was the stewardship coordinator at Grand Bay for about 7 years. And so did a lot of the same kind of work that Eric does. And about 4.5 years ago, came back to Alabama. I had been commuting over there. I came back, and I'm now working for the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, our state lands division. Our Department of Conservation and Natural Resources is kind of a confusing beast to some folks. We have our state lands division. There's the parks division. There's marine resources, and there's wildlife and freshwater fisheries, and then an administrative section. And so within our state lands division, we have a coastal section, and so I administer that now, which includes our coastal zone management program and the Weeks Bay Reserve. Both of those are federally funded, or actually state partnerships with the feds. So in the case of Weeks Bay, NOAA provides 70% of our funding, and with coastal zone management, NOAA provides 50% of our funding. We operate under the Coastal Zone, or the Coastal Alabama Management Program. It's the biggest title nobody's ever heard of. It's actually in state legislative code that we administer our coastal zone through this. We have about 607 miles of shoreline, and it is our actual administrative zone is like the 10-foot continuous contour. So if you took a 10-foot elevation contour, there are certain regulations that apply to you from there down to open water with regards to activities that are allowed with building, construction, piers, things like that. So you can see our coastal zone, that strip of land that's 10 feet or less, most of Baldwin County is cut out of that. You see a little bit in Mobile County and then the Tensas Delta, but so our programs are applicable across both counties, but then we have that narrow strip right along the coast where we have a little more control over people. We interact with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management there. They do all the permitting and monitoring and something called federal consistency. So they make a determination of whether an action is consistent with the program. And thank God I don't have to do that side of it, because it's mind-numbing, but very necessary to make sure that things like offshore drilling or pipelines or things like that are done in a way that doesn't affect the environment. But it's I'm glad we have ADEM doing that part. We've been doing this for about 40 years in Alabama. We give out funds to local communities, which they match with local funds to do things like planning and zoning updates, public access improvements. So if you've ever been to Gulf Shores and walked over a dune walkover, odds are that's something that we've had some of our money go to. Access piers, signage, canoe and kayak trails, just a variety of different improvements. We do a lot of public outreach. Alabama Coastal Cleanup is part of that. And then we work with local governments, so that comprehensive planning, the zoning and subdivision regulations, things that aren't all that, if you'd asked me 10 years ago if I had any interest in that, I would have said no way. I've tried to tell myself now that that by being involved in this, that I can have a bigger impact on how we interact with the environment, how we develop the area by doing this than I could just managing a single parcel of land. So it's maybe I'm just deluding myself there, but it's kind of nice to think that we can inject some sense of environmental advocacy into that world. We think a lot about coastal hazards, so we've been doing some long-term shoreline monitoring, and we've been developing the Alabama Coastal Comprehensive Plan with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we think a lot about sea level rise impacts and how that's going to change our environment. We've also developed something called the Alabama Community Resilience Initiative. This is some more of the NOAA funding that comes to us, where we've developed this South Alabama Flood Engagement Team. And this is an effort to help local communities understand their flood risks and understand how they can mitigate those risks through better management and also interacting with the National Flood Insurance Program. So this has brought together a lot of floodplain managers, allows us to give them education and training on different topics. And we're doing some things with that, like open space mapping, where we're mapping areas in the coastal communities that are still open and might be candidates for conservation or already in conservation that need to be better protected for long-term flood mitigation. And then most of you are very familiar with the NEAR system since you've been at Weak Space so much, but I'll throw this map in there just to say that's the other part of that coastal zone management that we do is the National Estuarine Research Reserve. There's 29 of those around the country. They are place-based, and they provide a place for us to do long-term research and monitoring. If any of y'all are thinking about graduate school in the future, the reserves have just started back up a fellowship program called the Margaret Davidson Fellowship, and it's a very well-funded program to basically provide you a stipend while you're in graduate school and to do work at a reserve. So it's we're in the process of finalizing selection for this year's for the inaugural round of this. Actually, this is a replacement of an older program that went away a few years ago, but it provides an opportunity for folks to come and get that graduate training at a reserve and be working on local topics that are very important to us. So I'm going to transition a little bit into kind of some just general thoughts I have about how we interact with the environment and how we view nature, and it kind of ties to some of the work that you guys have been doing restoration-wise. Some of you may recognize what's on the screen here. Those are tree cores from slash pine trees. And if you look at those, you see the various rings that represent, a dark and light ring together represent a year. And you can see some spots where there's some inclusions. Some of those are fire scars. And so, that's one way we have to look at our world and start to think about what did the past look like, times that we weren't there, but we can get some clue as to what was happening in the environment, how nature was functioning with or without us. I think it's really important that we think about that natural history. That's something else that's beginning to be missing from a lot of college curriculums is a real deep background in understanding the natural history around you. That photo there is William Bartram, who was an explorer in the 1700s. He and his dad, John Bartram, was the botanist of the King of England. They came to the Southeast. William walked around and rode a horse and took a boat, from South Carolina all the way over into Louisiana, cut through the interior, collecting plants, interacting with Native Americans, and basically just giving us a really fantastic snapshot of what the Southeast looked like late 1700s. So at a time where we already had a lot of influence of humans, Native Americans in very large numbers in some areas, and also earlier settlers. And so if you've never read that, I encourage you to check out Bartram's Travels and read that. It's kind of flowery language like you might expect from late 1700s, but this man saw some things, and he came through our area right here. He basically spent some time in the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. And so it's really interesting to see his perspective on things. One other thing, in this slide, you see on the upper right, you see some sand dunes, and that's some of my family. I think that picture was 1911. and they're down at Fort Morgan. They took a boat from Weeks Bay. They took a sailing boat from Weeks Bay down to Fort Morgan. And if you notice, there are trees sticking up out of those sand dunes. So there was a horrible hurricane in 1906 down here on the coast. So that sand dune probably overtopped those trees in the 1906 storm. Those are dead live oaks on the beach. But you know, nature's resilient. It's popping back up. But you can look at some of these old historic photographs, historic records, and you can begin to piece together what the environment looked like in the past. So we're going to think a little bit about our philosophy of being a naturalist, our land ethic. What do you need to study natural history, and what are some references? We may touch on climate change. We may run out of time for all that, but and just thinking about coastal habitats a little bit. So I'm not going to try to think about mastering a subject or taxonomic snobbery. That's if you pay attention to plant names at all, you see they change a lot. There's a lot of guys who publish papers changing the names of things, and all of a sudden the name you learned in your classes doesn't apply anymore. Scientists use that common language, and we don't want to confuse ourselves too much, but you know, things change, and if you use an old name for a wax myrtle, most folks are not, they're going to know what you're talking about. Another really important figure that if you've never read a Sand County Almanac, that's another book to put on your summer reading list. Aldo Leopold is kind of the father of wildlife biology. This is one of my favorite quotes of his. It's one of the penalties of an ecological education that one lives alone in a world of wounds. It's one of those things where once you begin to understand nature, you start to see things that most folks don't see. Most folks just see that it's all green and it's good. You know, many of you probably had no idea about those invasive plants that you're removing prior to starting your work with Gulf Corps. It just looked green to you and it looked good. So we have to kind of think about what else is out there, but it can be a heavy burden on you to begin to understand what humans have done to nature. And so you have to kind of balance that in your life of trying to get a balance of thinking about things you can control, thinking about what you can influence and what you can't. So some of the things just to think about briefly, you know, when we think about natural world, what's pristine, what's wilderness? Is there such a thing anymore? Humans have influenced habitats all around the world for as long as humans have been here. So it's really difficult to find a natural system that's truly untouched by people at some point. Our interaction with the environment is not deterministic. So it's something that's dynamic. You think about, you go out and mow your grass, what comes back next year in your yard, you didn't determine that. You set it back, you set succession back, but there could be weed seeds or trees or things that pop up in your yard that you had no control over. And so we make an action, we can't totally predict the outcome of that action, or there could be unintended consequences. And the other thing is, you know, while we're destructive to the environment, but we also can help to produce and maintain some really sustainable and diverse systems. You know, on a small scale, think about a butterfly garden in your yard. A large scale, we put prescribed fire back on the landscape because the landscape won't carry fire the way that we want it to. When we think about that, we think about historical ecology. We want to understand the past, but we're also focused on what do we want something to be in the future. And so what do we want a habitat to look like down the road? And so we're using that to inform our restoration efforts. So you guys have been out restoring habitats. You've been removing invasive species. You know, what are you actually doing on those sites? What's the goal, and what's it going to look like in a few years? So we really have to think about how we are influencing nature with the work that we do. So I like to play a game with folks, good or bad. You know, clear cuts. Anybody have a reaction to that? Thumbs up or thumbs down? You don't want to unmute. Thumbs down on clear cuts. I see a lot of thumbs down. A clear cut is, you know, a silvicultural practice where you take all the trees off a site. And most folks' gut reaction to say that's bad. But what if it is a clear cut where you're removing a loblolly pine plantation to restore it with longleaf pine? Then maybe it's a good thing. So it's all about the situation that you're in. Erosion, you know, good or bad. Anybody have a thumbs up or thumbs down on erosion? got kind of down, middle. I personally love to go sit on a sandbar on the river um, and enjoy some adult recreation there. Um, you can't do that if there's no erosion, right? That sandbar doesn't exist if a stream bank upstream is not eroded. Invasive species, that one's probably universally bad, although, you know, yeah, we don't like invasives. Uh, you know, wildfire, when we get into that nuance of fire, wildfire has that negative connotation of you're destroying something. You get into prescribed fire, it's a little different. How about biodiversity? We talk about biodiversity. We want a lot of biodiversity, but um, what if you are a darter in a little stream somewhere where you're really the only fish in there, and all of a sudden someone introduces bluegill brim into that stream? You don't really want there to be more biodiversity because now you have competition. Biodiversity can be increased by invasive species sometimes, maybe in the short term. And so that number by itself, you know, an index of biodiversity doesn't always mean good. It may mean good, but it could be a bad thing. This one is mainly from the world of white-tailed deer here, but supplemental feeding. Supplemental feeding could be a bird feeder in your backyard, which we all seem to think is okay, but there are diseases that birds pass to each other at bird feeders. There's conjunctivitis that birds can pass where their eyes get really nasty, and some other things. When we think about feeding things like white-tailed deer, that's a great place to pass things like brucellosis and chronic wasting disease, and now the new one, the prion disease. I'm sorry, my name's escaped me there, but you know, we have lots of problems of things being fed at a common source, and you have other animals interacting. And then we talk about population control. That's a very hot topic. There's some things like feral hogs, in some places feral cats that they're not native, they're interacting negatively in the environment. But when you begin to talk about population control, that brings in the human emotion to it. And so we have to think about those value judgments. This is kind of a scale that I think about sometimes. Some folks are kind of on that thing of human comfort at all costs, or don't do it in my backyard. It's green, it's got to be good. Sometimes politicians are only thinking about like a 4-year cycle. You know, I need to make sure things are good so I can get reelected. Or maybe as a state employee, I'm thinking about I need to make sure I can get my next grant. Some folks think about those value judgments towards environmentalism as just to make themselves feel good. When you get to the level of ecological restoration, you're really taking a bigger picture approach of trying to put something back to a state that can be thought of as a functioning ecosystem. So we think about that restoration, we're returning something to a past condition. What do we want the future to look like? And then how do we determine what it used to look like? It's easy with some things, it's difficult in nature. And then we have to think about our value judgments once again. If you ask most folks how to restore the barrier islands off the coast of Alabama and Mississippi, most folks come back to a footprint that is about the 1960s. And that's because, you know, for a lot of the adult population, that is a time frame that they can remember, and they remember massive damage from Hurricane Camille. And so they want to put things back to the 1960s. Well, barrier islands, we know, are extremely dynamic. They're always changing. And so why the 1960s? What makes that special? So we have to really be able to justify our decisions in this. So the real thing to think about there is that nature's not static. Everything is on an ecological trajectory. You go and do some management action, and it knocks things back, and you're changing that trajectory some, but things are still going to happen to that site. Going back to the yard thing, you mow your grass and you're knocking it back. It's on a new ecological trajectory, depending on what weed seeds blow in there, or how often you mow, or if somebody sprays herbicide on your yard. The same thing with old field succession, where you see a farm field go fallow and you see things grow up in it. Over time, that changes. Right at the reserve at Weeks Bay, the area to the west of the visitor center, that was a watermelon field probably 50 years ago. It's now a patch of woods. You know, it has gone through that successional pattern. there was a huge debate in the 20s and 30s in the U.S. over whether longleaf pine was a climax forest or not, or because fire was in there as a disturbance, maybe it shouldn't have been the climax. That was some of the earliest ecological debates over the southeastern habitats, was whether or not we should think about pine being a dominant type, because if you take fire out of the equation, it quickly gets taken over by things like water oak. So when we're thinking about restoration, we have to think about a reference condition. What do we want things to look like? And so that's where it's important to have places like estuarine research reserves, where you, especially things like salt marsh, where you have some reference of, thank you, chronic wasting disease. I see somebody pop that up there. Could not think of that one. We have a reference condition that, you know, of salt marsh. What should a salt marsh look like? What plants should be there? What should the elevation characteristics be? And so we have to have some places that are somewhat undisturbed to be able to understand that. We have to think about our project time frame. The scale matters. How much time do we have to implement it and to evaluate it? We can't ignore human influence on that. And then how disruptive will that restoration be to other sites around it? And then also, how vulnerable will that restoration be to recurrent natural events, things like hurricanes? So as we start to think about doing those kind of restorations, understanding the environment, there's a lot of things you need to think about. And this can take a lifetime, the geology, soils, topography, climate, the plants and animals, the human influence. Those are things that it just takes a long time to learn. There's lots of ways that we can begin to piece together that picture. Archaeology, you might say, how in the world is archaeology important? Well, we can begin to piece together, there's some middens in Mississippi, Native American middens that are oyster shells, where they basically, Native Americans discarded their oyster shells. They've recently gone back into those middens, take shells from a known layer, and they're looking at the radioisotopes in them. They're beginning to understand what bacterial conditions were happening. So how much fecal coliform was in the water from human influence at that time, based on what they're finding in those oyster shells that are 3,000 or 4,000 years old in that midden. We can use those accounts of folks like William Bartram. Those are great to understand what the condition was in a site. Oral histories that have been taken. There are public land surveys. When they surveyed these lands out, the surveyors oftentimes would have a corner tree on every section of land. So every mile they would have a corner tree, and they noted what species of tree that was. And so you can begin to piece together what was growing in an area based on those corner tree markers. And some of those go back early into the 1800s. We had things like U.S. Coast Survey, where they were very accurately mapping the coastline and indicating what kind of trees were there. Old oyster resource reports, dendrochronology, like I mentioned earlier, we're taking tree rings and trying to understand things. And there's old maps that help. So there's lots of good information. When we think about human impacts on the environment, invasive species is up there pretty high. Hydrologic alterations. There's a lot of areas on the coast where we have put a ditch in for some reason, either to drain water out so that we could farm, to drain water out so that mosquitoes wouldn't be as bad. For a variety of reasons, we have altered that hydrology. We've had many years of fire suppression and lots of habitat conversion. Here's a nice little brochure from my alma mater from the 20s. Actually, it looks like it's 1939, where we're talking about kudzu, and we're going to promote the use of kudzu. So don't always believe what your ag experiment station puts out, what your county agent tells you. Fire in coastal ecosystems, we know that pre-settlement that fire happened a little different than it happens now. These are some data from Ed Comerick, who was at Tall Timbers over in Florida, but he basically put together the number of lightning ignited fires versus the number of thunderstorm days for a number of years. And this was a little bit east of us over in Florida, so we're not quite in exactly the same pattern here in Alabama. But you can see that most of the fires were happening in these, when you started to have this peak of thunderstorm days, and these early thunderstorms in that part of Florida are kind of dry thunderstorms, not a lot of rain. So there were lightning ignited fires that were running across the landscape. And prior to us having road systems, those would have run basically and only been contained by creek drainages. So I had a good friend whose dissertation work was on bobwhite quail in the Connecticut National Forest, and he had radio collars on quail. He found a direct correlation his movement data. So a juvenile quail was much more likely to pick up and move 5 or 6 miles, which is a dispersal movement for a quail. That's a long way to go for something that normally is on 40 acres of land. Those quail picked up and moved during this time period in May, June, and July, when on average they might see in their little plot of land, they might see a fire that would totally wipe out where they lived. So they're genetically programmed to pick up and move during that time period to get to a place where that maybe it wasn't burned. So that's thinking on a grand scale for how that fire is affecting wildlife. We went through many years of fire suppression. We had the Southern Forestry Education Project. This was literally folks going around on the back of trucks, like with bands, like politicians traveling and basically telling people not to burn, telling people how horrible it was to burn. Dixie Crusaders, another program to try to keep people from burning the woods. Smokey the Bear, started out as a campaign to totally eliminate any burning, any cultural burning that was happening. The cooperative quail study, that was actually the move to begin to understand fire and how it was impacting wildlife, started in the 30s. And so we've had this period of fire suppression, and then now beginning to have an awakening of how we understand fire. And that fire suppression was done because there were some major wildfires in the US that killed a lot of people. They were burning over areas that had timber harvest, very destructive practices, a lot of slash on the ground. And there was one called Peshtigo, where there were, I think it's Wisconsin, Peshtigo is Wisconsin. There were thousands of people that died, people that jumped into wells to try to save themselves, and they died in a well full of water because it got so hot. Just horrible scenes of people dying. So we had this national outcry against fire. We had a lot of stand conversion. So we were converting stands from longleaf to slash or loblolly. A lot of this followed on the end of the turpentine industry. Coming back to that kudzu, from that document there, they're saying that kudzu had been confined to the edges of fields for a period of 35 years and had never become a pest or spread to where it wasn't wanted. So, there's our government-funded university telling the world, let's plant kudzu because we've had it there for 35 years. It never escaped. I won't even go into this list of invasive plants. You guys have seen most of them and have dealt with most of them, but most of those were brought in one way or another as either an economic or a horticultural landscaping type crop. So we have brought most of these upon ourselves. The same with most of the animals, feral hogs, nutria, armadillo, coyotes. Some of these don't have a whole lot of effect. Some have a lot of effect on us. And in some cases, their interaction with the environment, they fit in quite well, and maybe they even fill a niche of something we've lost. We don't have red wolves here anymore. Maybe coyotes fill part of that niche. And we can even have native invasives. What do I mean by that? What does it mean to be native? You can buy a native mix of wildflower seeds. If you plant those in Alabama, it probably has some things that are native to Texas and not native to Alabama, but it's considered native to the Southeast. What does that mean? So that can be a really site-specific thing. We have helped facilitate the movement of a lot of things like coyotes. In some cases, we remove the ecological barrier. So we take out fire, and slash pine will invade upslope into drier areas where longleaf pine should be. You put the fire back in, you begin to push the slash pine back down to the edge of the bayou, the creek where it should be. Those invasives a lot of times can really affect our restorations. So in all that, we really have to begin to understand the past. We have to think about the past and how we interact with it. And we have to have some teamwork to get the job done. We have to think about how we all work together. That's one thing Gulf Corps has been a fantastic resource for us in having you guys available as a source of labor, but also folks who are able to take on some of the harder duties that we have, thinking about some of the elevation work y'all have helped with, something that takes a little more thinking. Conservation is a long game. It really is something we have to be thinking many years down the road, especially when we think about things like acquiring properties or the management of a site. In the remainder of my career, there's some places that we burn that I might see 5 or 6 more burns in my life, in my working career on those. So you have to be thinking about, how do I prep it for the next person to come in? How do I make it where they can where we're setting the framework and the foundation where they can continue to be effective after I'm gone. It's just kind of a shot from this is actually from South Mississippi, and this was a guy named Roland Harper, who he wrote several floras of Alabama and Mississippi, Florida, but he would travel the trains in the teens and 20s and get off. And he said any good botanist should be able to understand a site in an afternoon after hopping off the train, wandering around. But the University of Alabama has his archives and has all these photos of sites. So this was somewhere around close to the Grand Bay near Mississippi. That's kind of the landscape we're shooting for. We want something pretty wide open, has a lot of that understory diversity. So I think that kind of wraps up that side. I wanted to take just a minute to tell you all about the personnel situation in Alabama and how you go about thinking about a job in conservation with the state of Alabama. It's not always easy to navigate it. And so I'm going to just try to give you a few tips on that real quick. The website you go to is personnel.alabama.gov. And on that site, they've recently reworked it. There's a lot of different guides for jobs, but you can go to the job announcements tab here, and you can see what things that are open for application at the time. And if this will pull up, you basically type in and enter, and it is everything under the sun. I mean, there's thousands of classifications in the state. And so if you search for something like biologist, it's going to pull up a variety of things. And so I'm seeing here biologist 3 wildlife, biologist aid. The things like there's some of those classes that are things that you very likely wouldn't get into unless you were already in the agency. So like a biologist 3, that classification goes from biologist aid, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Pretty much you can get into a biologist aid position, you get into a bio 1, maybe a bio 2 from the outside. Pretty much the 3, 4, or 5, you pretty much need to already be in a position in the state to get bumped in with those others. But on here, some of these are available to apply online. So you can see it might say apply paper on the side, or it might say apply online. Most of the ones that you might be interested in are going to be apply paper. And so there's actually a printable form that you would apply for. But you also you basically create an account on this web page where you can fill in all your information, save that information, and when you see a job you want to apply for, you can actually just print a PDF of your information. So it makes it really easy to save that stuff, update it. One thing that most folks don't realize is the way this works is, let's say for biologist 1, there's a register. So if it may be open continuous, so it may be open all the time, so you can apply anytime. They probably only grade it 4 times a year. So they're going to pull those applications that have come in that quarter, they're going to grade them and rank them. And in order to get selected for an interview, you have to be in the top 10 or the top 10 in ties. And so in some cases, there may only be 10 people. In some cases, there may be 40 or 50 people there may be one person in number 1, and there might be 39 people in number 2. And that means that the top 10 is 1 through 40 in that register. But so we don't necessarily announce that we are hiring a biologist somewhere. You get on that register, and when an agency needs to hire a biologist, they're going to pull that register from state personnel, and then state personnel is going to give us that list of people that's available to interview. So it makes it a little hard, and some of these positions, natural resource planner is one that we use at the reserve and the coastal program. Up until about Christmas, that one was considered a closed register. So they only opened it every couple of years. And so the last time we hired somebody in the planner register, that register was over 2 years old. So most of the people on that register had moved on, had other jobs, had no interest, but we had to actually work that register before we could ask them to re-advertise it. So it takes a while for that to happen. Now that one is open continuous. And so it's one of those things where now you can get on there and apply at any time, and they're going to grade it about 4 times a year, and then we can get an updated list. But it makes it a little hard for us to recruit sometimes, specifically trying to find a person that we might have an interest in. Being open continuous makes it a little better. But the things that y'all would probably want to look at would be bioaid, biologist 1, biologist 2, and natural resource planner. So if you got on those four, I saw a question pop up. You can apply for as many as you want to at a time. You can, I think they'll let you. I think you can like fax in 10 a day. But it's one of those things. I highly encourage you to use that online application where it saves your application, even if it's one you have to apply paper. You do your account, you save all your information, then you print out that PDF and either mail it or fax it to them. If you don't get the answer you want, I highly encourage you to call them. If you get your card back and it says you didn't rank on that register, make sure they graded it right. So that's one thing to think about. Is I'll show you in this application, you basically just put in your employment and you put in the duties of what you did there. So something like Gulf Corps work, don't limit yourself to that box right there. Put as much stuff as you can think of. If you touched a chainsaw, if you touched a weed eater, if you drove a truck, if you drove a boat, if you did anything, talk about the herbicides you used. So the thing to think about with this is the person grading this, they're not a content expert in what they're grading. There's somebody sitting in the personnel office who is a clerical aide who has no idea what a wildlife biologist does. They're working from a document that has been, they do job studies, and they'll ask all the biologists once, what do you do in your job? And they'll create kind of a checklist out of that. And so what you want to do is you want to hit all the keywords so that when somebody's grading that application, they're seeing your keywords pop up and they're giving you points. So that's a really important thing to do. Be truthful in what you're saying you did, but make sure you don't leave the details out. And that's really the most important thing you can do. Once you get on one of those registers, I think it's 2 years that you stay on. And so you tell them what counties that you can see here, you can actually pick the counties that you're eligible to work in. Some folks just put statewide. Down here, a lot of folks will put this number 92, which is Mobile and Baldwin counties. And you stay on that for a couple of years, and you can go online and check your register status. And basically, if there is a job in that area and you're eligible for somebody to call you based on that, they'll pull that register. And if they want to interview you, they don't have to interview the top 10, but that's all we can see is the top 10. So that just kind of gives you a little heads up into how you navigate that world. It's one of those things that we're trying to do better about, actually reaching out on our social media accounts when we do have an opening somewhere. But for Natural Resource Planner, for instance, when we announce it, if we're not real strategic in that, it might be that nobody new can get on it, because we asked to pull the register. We might be looking at now 4-month-old data, whereas if so we try to be real savvy about waiting until we know that it's been updated with the most recent people. But definitely take the time to look at what classes are available and get an application in for those. If you have new experience, you can't just reapply. You actually have to contact them and say, I want to update my application based on this new experience that I have, based on this new job. And one other important thing to know is that there are pay bands within each of those jobs, where it's a number so-and-so to number so-and-so, where these are the steps. And so you're eligible for step raises basically every year, either 2.5% or 5% within those bands. But when you're coming in to start a job, typically we are limited to starting somebody at the low end of that salary, unless they have salary history that can justify us bringing them in somewhere else in that pay scale. And so that's something that can be disappointing to people at times. They think, well, maybe I can start up here at the top, but and they don't spend a lot of time looking at graduate school work as being very relevant to job experience, which is a mistake in my mind. Most graduate students are, if they're on a stipend, they're paid on a third time or a half-time assistantship. So they're probably working 40 or 50 hours a week, but they're paid for 13 hours or 20 hours. And so that they don't let you double that number or triple that number to say, this is what my yearly salary would have been. So that's an unfortunate side of it. It keeps us from recruiting really good folks straight out of school at anything other than the baseline salary. But so that kind of gives you an idea of how you might apply for a state position. So I think that kind of covers it. I know I've been in a lot of directions in the last hour, and I appreciate y'all all staying awake.
No, that was good. Thank you. Don't have a lot of time for questions, so I think I'll just pick out some of the ones that kind of repeated. There's a lot of people asking about the natural history section of your presentation. So Cody, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, let me find it again. Kind of forgot what I put down. Yeah, here we are. What sources have you used to deepen your knowledge in natural history?
I really have used everything I can get my hands on. I mean, field guides. There's some really good books out there that are, I use a lot of dichotomous keys, so plant keys, but then also use some more layperson field guides that are full of pictures. There's one called Florida Wetland Plants that is no longer in print, but you can find the PDF now online. University of Florida Press, I believe, but they now have the PDF. And that is a fantastic resource for wetland plants in the Southeast. I hope they reprint that one someday. But really just there's a lot of good texts on geology that, and then reading some of those historical accounts of folks like William Bartram, Philip Henry Goss. There's a number of folks who traveled the Southeast in the 1800s and provide some great context.
Awesome.
Okay. Nice.
And then I know you mentioned something about like made up animals people saw. I know Creighton had a question about that some other people also asked.
It was kind of amazing. More people said they had seen a honey bear, which I'm not sure what that is. One guy told me that's a little bear. We have black bears in Alabama, and they're Florida black bears. Although if they cross over into Mississippi, I don't know if that automatically makes them Louisiana black bear or not. But the federal designation, they're independent subspecies. And now we actually have American black bear. But yeah, there were like 2 or 3 different kinds of bears. And then I actually have more people tell me they'd seen a black panther than bears. And as a biologist, that's one that's hard to. I don't know how familiar you guys are with mountain lions, but mountain lion, puma, panther, those are all the same thing. It's the most widest ranging mammal, Canada to tip of Argentina. And in all of scientific history, there has not been a black phase mountain lion found ever. There are black phase jaguars. They're in Central and South America. There are black phase leopards in Africa. There are jaguarundis that are kind of gray or orange, but there's never been a black panther. But that is what everybody has seen. So that's an interesting interaction with people. Yeah, that's a hard one. I do some delicate talking to folks sometimes about
that. And then when we were discussing you this morning, and when we saw that on your bio, you mentioned you had a farm, and you mentioned it in the presentation too. So does Ashley see here? She seems to be coming in and out. But she wanted to know what do you have on your farm? What kind of work do you do on there?
Yeah, so I grew up on this farm here that was primarily row crops. We did soybeans, corn. We had hogs when I was a kid. We had one thing that we grew when I was growing up was watermelons, and that was an incredibly difficult crop to deal with. They're 20 or 30 pounds. We did 20 or 30 acres every summer. You're loading out semi trucks with that. That somehow stopped right about the time I went off to college. My dad quit doing that. Imagine he didn't have the free labor. He always told me he paid me $27.50 a week. Currently I have I actually lease out some of my land to some guys who row crop on it. I had cows until about 3 weeks ago, and with my job situation, I had to just make that choice to do away with the cows. My girls are not happy with that, but my fences were pretty weak, and I have slept easier at night knowing that I don't have to chase cows. But I still have some chickens, and still plant a garden and have fruit trees and things. But changing the area, it's not as easy to farm as it was. Unfortunately, we have a lot of sod farms coming in around us, and it's hard to make a living at it. And that's a hard choice to make, to step away from some of that. But it's only so much time in the day.
And then I guess last one here. I think Camille asked a really good one at the end here. You want to ask your question, Camille?
I will ask it. I have to read it word for word. If you were a temporary employee for a state, do you believe that there is an equal or better chance of getting selected into the top 10 over someone that had more education? Do you believe that experience or education is more valuable in order to qualify for an entry-level position?
So if you're in a temporary position, so if you're in a position like a laborer class with the state of Alabama, so we can recruit a laborer without going through all that state personnel side of things. There's an application for a laborer that you would bring to us at Weeks Bay, if we have one of those positions. And so if you're in that laborer job, if you can get onto a register and you're reachable in that top 10 on that register. So let's say you were in a laborer, but you got into a BioAid register. If we wanted to hire you as a BioAid, we do not have to interview anybody else. If you're on that register and you're reachable in the top 10, we can just directly appoint you to that because you were already in a position with us. And so, yeah, it helps because for one thing, we know you, we've worked with you, we've seen the work ethic, and so we can, and so those temporary positions, they're what are considered non-merit. So you're getting insurance, you're getting retirement benefits, but you don't have the merit system protections as far as you're basically an at-will employee where you can be let go for no cause. We can just say, well, we don't need your services anymore, and we can let you go. But once you're in one of those merit classes, you have a 6-month probationary period. If you make it through that 6-month probation and you're appointed into a full-time position, then you now have those merit system protections where there has to be a much more rigorous process followed to let somebody go from that. So yeah, I think definitely it is a good thing to be in one of those positions. It gives you some more to put on an application, and it gives you face to face with the people you want to work with.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we do have something to move on to, but we can be flexible with our time. If anybody has like a question that they really, really want to ask, now would be the time for that.
And if nobody has anything else, I don't know if I saw it on your slides, Will, but did you include contact information? Would you be willing to give your email out for people to contact you for questions? You can just put it in the chat box if you want. And I have it too. I can give it to folks just in case they want to reach back out.
Yeah, let me do that. Yeah, y'all feel free to reach out with questions. I'm always willing to chat if you need help with. I'm willing to look over folks' applications before you put them in. To give you hints on that. It's one of those things where it's a difficult enough process that I'm willing to help folks out with that. But I've enjoyed talking to you all today, and really appreciate the work you do. And it's been a great experience interacting with folks for the last few years with Gulf Corps. So I've really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Yeah, we hope we get to continue too. All right.
Definitely.
All right. Thanks, Will.
All right,
everybody,
thank you.
You can say bye.